Story 1. The snow had been coming down heavily all day, blanketing the landscape in a thick layer of white. The wind howled through the empty trees, creating an eerie chorus that echoed through the secluded forest. It was the dead of winter, and the perfect time for a weekend getaway at the winter cabin. Sarah and her friends had been planning this trip for months, excited to escape the busy city and enjoy some peace and quiet in the remote cabin. It was a beautiful cabin, made of sturdy logs and complete with a cozy fireplace, but there was always something unsettling about it. Maybe it was the isolation or the creepy old photographs hanging on the walls. But Sarah couldn't shake off the feeling that they were not alone. As night fell, the group settled in, sipping hot cocoa and sharing scary stories around the crackling fire. But as the fire began to die down, so did the laughter. The wind outside had grown even stronger, causing the cabin to creak and moan. Sarah tried to reassure everyone that it was just the wind, but she couldn't ignore the unease that was creeping up her spine. They all decided to turn in early, but Sarah found it hard to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear strange whispers and creaking floorboards. She convinced herself that it was just her imagination and eventually drifted off to sleep. But her peaceful slumber was short-lived as she awoke to a loud crashing sound. Her heart pounding, she sat up and strained to listen. Silence. Maybe it was just a dream. But then she heard it again, a scratching sound coming from the window. Heart racing, Sarah slowly got out of bed and tiptoed towards the window, her eyes scanning the darkness outside. She could see nothing but the beams of moonlight breaking through the snow-covered branches. Just as she was about to turn away, she caught a glimpse of something outside, a figure, tall and dark, standing in the snow. Frozen with fear, Sarah watched as the figure approached the window, its face hidden by a hood. It seemed to be beckoning her, its bony fingers tapping on the glass. Sarah's mind raced. Could it be a lost hiker or a local looking for shelter? But as the figure stepped into the light, Sarah's screams echoed through the cabin. It was not a person at all, but a grotesque creature with a twisted body and glowing red eyes. It let out a bone-chilling screech before lunging towards the window, its sharp claws scraping against the glass. Sarah stumbled back, tripping over her friends who had woken up at her scream. As they all huddled together in fear, the creature continued to scratch and screech at the window, its haunting laughter filling the cabin. They were trapped, with no way of escape as the storm raged on outside. As the night dragged on, the creature continued its torment, scratching at the windows and doors, trying to break in. And with each passing hour, Sarah and her friends could feel its presence growing stronger and more malevolent. They were stuck in a nightmare, and there seemed to be no way out. Dawn finally broke, and with it came an eerie silence. The storm had passed, and the creature was nowhere to be seen. Sarah and her friends quickly packed their things and fled the cabin, never looking back. They never spoke of that night again, but the memories haunted them for years to come. And as for the winter cabin, it remained empty, a cautionary tale for those who dared to stay there during the long, cold nights of winter. Story 2. It was a night like any other in the small, isolated winter cabin deep in the forest. The wind howled outside, making the old wooden walls creak and groan. Inside, the only light came from the flickering fireplace, casting eerie shadows across the cozy living room. Jenny and her friends had rented the cabin for a weekend getaway, seeking a break from their busy lives in the city. But as the night went on, they couldn't shake the feeling of unease that seemed to linger in the air. As they huddled together in front of the fire, sipping hot cocoa and telling ghost stories, they laughed off the strange noises they heard outside. But when one of their friends went missing, their laughter turned to terror. Frantically searching the cabin and the surrounding snowy woods, they found no trace of their friend. As the minutes ticked by, their panicked whispers grew louder, their fear consuming them. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the cabin, causing them to freeze in fear. They all exchanged terrified looks, knowing that the scream had come from their friend. Without hesitation, they grabbed flashlights and ventured out into the dark, snowy night to find their friend. The wind buffeted against them, making it difficult to see and hear anything. But as they followed the sound of their friend's screams, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. The sight of the dilapidated building sent shivers down their spines, but they had to find their friend. They cautiously made their way inside, their hearts pounding in their chests. What they saw inside the cabin made their blood run cold. The walls were covered in eerie paintings of snowy landscapes, with red handprints splattered across them. In the center of the room, their friend lay motionless, her body contorted in an unnatural position. They screamed and rushed to her side, only to be met with a startling sight. The paintings on the walls seemed to come to life, the snow swirling and the handprints moving as if alive. And in the middle of it all, a figure appeared, its eyes glowing a sinister red. The friends screamed in terror, scrambling to escape the cabin. But the door had been locked from the outside, leaving them trapped with a horrifying entity. With every passing second, the figures in the paintings grew larger and more menacing, and the air became thick with malice. In a desperate attempt to escape, they broke through a window and ran into the freezing darkness, the icy wind biting at their skin. It was only when they were a safe distance away did they dare to look back. The abandoned cabin had disappeared, leaving no trace of its existence. And with it, their friend had vanished as well. The group vowed never to return to the winter cabin, knowing that it held secrets much darker than they could have ever imagined. Story 3. It was the dead of winter when the Brown family decided to take a much-needed vacation in their secluded cabin in the mountains. The snow was piling up and the icy winds were howling outside, but inside the cozy cabin, the family felt safe and warm. As the night crept in, Mr. Brown lit the fire in the fireplace, and Mrs. Brown prepared hot chocolate for their children, Tommy and Sarah. The children giggled and laughed as they played board games by the warm fire. But as the night grew darker, a strange sense of unease began to settle in. Mrs. Brown dismissed it as the effect of the cold weather, but Mr. Brown couldn't shake off the feeling that they were being watched. He brushed it off and followed Mrs. Brown's lead, trying to enjoy the family time. But as they were about to settle in for the night, they heard a loud knocking on the door. Mr. Brown cautiously opened the door to find no one there. He shrugged it off, thinking it was just the wind, and closed the door tightly. As they were getting ready for bed, Sarah complained of a strange tapping noise coming from the window. Mr. Brown went to investigate, but again found nothing. He reassured the family that all was well and tucked them into bed. However, as the night progressed, the strange occurrences only increased. The family heard footsteps outside their bedroom and whispering voices in the hallway. The doors creaked open and shut on their own, and a cold draft seemed to follow them wherever they went. Mrs. Brown became increasingly worried, but Mr. Brown chalked it off as their minds playing tricks on them. But when he went to get firewood for the night, he noticed a set of footprints leading up to the cabin and then disappearing into thin air. Feeling a cold chill run down his spine, Mr. Brown quickly gathered the firewood and rushed back inside. But as he was stacking the logs, he saw a figure standing outside the window, staring in at the family. It was a tall, dark figure with glowing red eyes. Panicked, Mr. Brown called out to his family, and they all huddled together in fear. The knocking on the door became more frantic, and the windows rattled violently. Suddenly, the fire in the fireplace extinguished, and the room plunged into darkness. In the flickering light of a candle, they saw the figure standing in front of them, a wicked grin on its face. It spoke in a deep, guttural voice, telling them that they were never alone in the cabin. A family had once stayed there, but they never left. And now they were trapped in the cabin, destined to spend eternity with the other lost souls. The Brown family screamed in terror as the figure disappeared, leaving them in complete darkness. They could hear the laughter of the spirits surrounding them and the sound of a howling blizzard outside. They were trapped in the cabin for eternity. The cold, desolate cabin became their prison, and they were never heard from again. Every winter, the cabin remains desolate, but on the coldest of nights, the laughter of the spirits can still be heard, warning others to never stay in the cursed winter cabin. Story 4. It was a dark and stormy night, the wind howling through the trees and the sound of thunder echoing through the sky. Sarah and her friends had decided to spend the weekend at a remote cabin in the woods to escape the chaos of city life. But as they arrived at the cabin, a feeling of unease crept over Sarah. The cabin had an eerie aura surrounding it, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. But her friends laughed off her concerns, dismissing it as just her overactive imagination. As the night went on, the storm grew more intense. The power went out, leaving the cabin in complete darkness. Sarah's anxiety grew as she heard strange noises coming from outside the cabin. She tried to convince her friends to leave and go back home, but they were determined to tough it out and enjoy their weekend. That's when the true horror began. In the middle of the night, Sarah woke up to the sound of scratching at the door. She sat up in bed, heart racing as she heard the scratching grow louder and more frantic. She woke up her friends, but when they went to check, there was no one there. But the scratching continued, getting closer and closer to the door. Sarah's friends were dismissive, thinking it was just an animal trying to get inside. But Sarah knew something was off. She couldn't shake off the feeling that they were not alone in the cabin. As the night went on, more strange occurrences began to happen. Objects would move on their own, doors would slam shut, and the air was filled with an unnatural chill. Sarah's fear turned into terror as she realized that they were not alone in the cabin. Something sinister was haunting them, and it seemed to be getting stronger with each passing moment. Sarah's friends were now starting to feel the same unease and fear that she had been feeling all along. They tried to leave, but the storm had blocked the only way out. They were trapped. As they huddled together, the cabin became colder and colder. They could see their breath now, and the windows were foggy. When they looked outside, they saw a figure standing in the storm. It was a tall, thin man with long arms and fingers, and a sinister smile on his face. They screamed and backed away from the windows, but the figure was now inside the cabin, slowly making its way towards them. Sarah and her friends were paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. The figure revealed itself to be the spirit of a man who had died in the cabin years ago. He had been waiting for someone to come and stay at the cabin, so he could have new victims to torment for all eternity. The storm intensified as the spirit grew stronger, and Sarah and her friends realized that they had stumbled upon a cursed winter cabin. The only way to break the curse was to solve the mystery of the man's death and put his spirit to rest. But they were running out of time. The spirit was getting more aggressive, and it was clear that he would not allow them to leave. Sarah and her friends knew that the only way to survive was to work together and solve the mystery before it was too late. They searched the cabin and found an old journal belonging to the man who died there. In it, He detailed how he had been wrongfully accused of a crime and had taken his own life in the cabin. The guilt and rage of being falsely accused had kept his spirit tied to the cabin, seeking revenge on anyone who dared to disturb him. With this knowledge, Sarah and her friends were able to put the man's spirit to rest by clearing his name and giving him the justice he deserved. As the storm cleared and the sun rose, the cabin was no longer filled with an air of horror and unease. Sarah and her friends left the cabin with a newfound appreciation for the power of forgiveness and the dangers of messing with the supernatural. Story 5. It was the start of winter, and snow covered the landscape like a thick white blanket. The trees were bare, the sky dark, and the air was bone-chillingly cold. In the midst of the snow-covered forest stood a small cabin, isolated from civilization. This was where 5 friends had planned to spend their winter vacation. As soon as they arrived at the cabin, they were captivated by its charm. The warm wooden interior, the cozy fireplace, and the breathtaking view of the snow-covered trees had them all feeling elated. They couldn't wait to spend the next few days here, away from the stresses of city life. As the night drew in, they sat around the fireplace, chatting and laughing. The sound of the snow falling outside created a peaceful ambience, and they all felt content. That was until they heard a loud knock on the door. Startled, they quickly got up to see who it was, but no one was there. "It's probably just the wind," said one of the friends, trying to brush off the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of their stomachs. They returned to their seats and carried on with their evening, but the knocking on the door grew louder and more persistent. One of the friends, being brave, decided to investigate. As he opened the door, he was met with a gust of cold wind and a figure standing in the darkness. The figure was tall and slender, with pale skin and long, stringy hair. Its eyes were empty black sockets, and its mouth was twisted into a sinister smile. The friends screamed in terror and slammed the door shut, locking it tightly. "What was that?" one of them exclaimed, shaking with fear. "I don't know, but it can't be human," another replied, their voice trembling. They all huddled together, too afraid to move or speak. Then they heard scratching at the windows and doors, along with faint whispers floating in the air. They knew they were not alone in the cabin. Terrified, they tried to come up with a plan to escape, but the storm outside had become too intense, and the snow was piling up, blocking their only means of escape. They were trapped with the unknown entity. As the night went on, they heard strange noises coming from different parts of the cabin. Furniture would move on its own, and sinister laughter echoed through the rooms. The friends were paralyzed with fear, too afraid to even close their eyes in case the figure appeared in front of them. As the first rays of morning light shone through the windows, the activity in the cabin came to a sudden stop, and the figure disappeared. The friends, exhausted and shaken, wasted no time in packing their belongings and fleeing the cabin. They never spoke of that horrifying night at the winter cabin again. But little did they know, the figure they had encountered was the vengeful spirit of a teenage girl who had died in that very cabin years ago. And now, she would continue to haunt anyone who dared to enter her domain. Story 6. It was supposed to be a cozy winter retreat, a place to escape the stresses of everyday life and embrace the calm and peacefulness of nature. The cabin, nestled deep in the woods, was a welcomed respite from the chaos of city living. Little did the group of friends know, their winter getaway would turn into a nightmare they would never forget. As soon as they arrived, things felt off. The air was thick and heavy, an eerie silence enveloped the cabin, and an icy chill seemed to seep through the walls. But they brushed it off as the usual winter atmosphere and carried on with their plans for a weekend of relaxation. As the night fell and the darkness crept in, the group gathered around the fireplace, sipping hot cocoa and sharing ghost stories. It was all fun and games until one of them noticed strange scratch marks on the cabin's front door. They dismissed it as animal scratches, but the unease in the air only grew. The next day, they headed out to explore the surrounding woods, hoping to take advantage of the winter wonderland. However, they soon found themselves lost in the midst of an endless sea of snow-covered trees. The compass and map they brought suddenly stopped working, leaving them stranded and confused. As the night came again, the group could feel a sense of danger looming over them. The darkness seemed to be alive, creeping closer and closer to the cabin. A deep guttural voice echoed through the trees, causing panic among the friends. They huddled together for comfort, too scared to even speak. That's when things took a turn for the worse. One by one, the friends started disappearing, leaving no trace behind. The remaining members of the group were tormented by terrifying visions, seeing their missing friends' faces in the shadows and hearing their cries for help. They soon realized that they were all trapped in a nightmare that had been waiting for them in this winter cabin. As the last member of the group tried to escape, they were met with a blood-curdling sight. A figure, tall and menacing, stood in their way, its eyes glowing red and its breath freezing the air. The figure let out a bone-chilling howl, and the cabin began to shake, the walls cracking as if by some supernatural force. In a last attempt to survive, the final member of the group made a desperate plea. They offered themselves as a sacrifice to the entity haunting the cabin, begging for their friends to be spared. The figure seemed to accept the offering, and with one final scream, the cabin fell silent, and the winter woods returned to their peaceful facade. Days later, when authorities arrived to investigate the missing persons report, all they found was a dilapidated cabin, buried in snow. The friends were never seen again, and their fate remains a mystery to this day. Some say the cabin was cursed, others blame it on the supernatural. But one thing is for sure, the winter cabin held a horror that no one could have ever imagined.